Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Wildcast. I have an amazing guest who's going to answer a lot of important questions I've personally had about Judaism and the Torah specifically. And it's a question that I think a lot of my students, I know it's a question a lot of my students, because everybody's looking for a rational basis to living their lives. We don't want to just be rational in the workplace or be rational in certain relationships. And then when it comes to our religion, we just sort of hang up our brains and just sort of faith away, right? That just never worked for me. So I'm a huge fan of my guest, who I just came off an hour and a half conversation with. We didn't put the whole hour and a half on, so don't fret. Rabbi Joshua Berman is my guest. He is a professor of Tanakh, of Hebrew scripture, of the Bible at Bar-Ilan University. He's a graduate of Princeton, and he got his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbanut, the chief rabbinate of Israel, after learning at Yeshivat Har Zion, which is a very prominent yeshiva in Israel, for 8 years. So he is an unbelievable Torah scholar on one hand, and also an academic, which is really why I wanted him on the podcast, because academics have to prove what they think. And I want him to be able to, I wanted to bring someone on that could demonstrate why you believe the Bible is real, its stories are true, and it actually comes from a higher place. We spent a good deal of time trying to understand other views of those who view the Bible as having been written or redacted, what's called the Bible critics or the documentary hypothesis. We spoke about that, and we talked about whether or not there's any evidence, any kind of archaeological evidence of like the Exodus story and other types of things. And what is a rational basis? Why should I believe in what the Bible has to say? Why should I follow its teachings? Is it just something I have to believe, or is it something that there's an actual rational basis for? And we got into that in a big bad way. So I hope you take a listen and enjoy Rabbi Joshua Berman. Okay, welcome to the Wildcast. I am so excited about this conversation to come. I have with me Rabbi Joshua Berman, professor of Tanakh, professor of Bible at Bar-Ilan, who is a real academic, very well respected in his field, studied at Princeton and at Yeshivot for many years, and is an ordained Orthodox rabbi at the same time. I want to just welcome you, Rabbi Berman. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Wildes, and thank you to the listening audience.
So you have, it is our pleasure, you've fused the academic and religious worlds, or you're trying to, in regard to some of our most fundamental beliefs. So here's my first question. You know, I'm an outreach professional, they call us. You know, I spent a lot of time trying to inspire my students who may not have had the benefit of a Jewish day school education, to view the Torah as not just a great piece of literature, which we all know it is, but as God's word to us. So as an academic and an Orthodox rabbi, and as your last book is entitled, Ani Mamin, which means I believe, you believe. So why do you as an academic believe that the Torah comes from God? Or is it something you simply accept as a matter of faith?
Right. Okay. So let me say first of all, Rabbi Wildes, just about one of the first things you said about fusing these two worlds, the world of the academy and belief and religion. I believe the two have to go together. There can be no true religion without truth. And so, therefore, if we have, demonstrated evidence of this, that, or the other, then we have to account for that. We have to work that into our system, especially in this day and age when, we're all online and we can all see all the claims that are made. There's just no hiding anymore. Maybe once upon a time people erected walls. We can't erect walls anymore. We probably never should have. Okay, because we want to worship God with the ultimate value, and that is truth. That's number one. Um, um, uh, Now, so to your question, as an academic, there's things that I can believe, there's things that I can prove. So the fact that I believe in the divinity of the Torah is not always something that I can prove, but I do believe that what I study academically does draw me closer to a conclusion, or at least a reasonable claim for me. that I can see divinity in the Torah, and that's without the kippah on my head, without the yarmulke that I wear on my head. And I see this specifically in the Torah's view of political power, that is just radically different and intricately woven tapestry of clauses and ideas and concepts and institutions um, that we find in the Torah that create a far less hierarchical and stratified society than anything that was known outside of Israel at the time. Every great thinker is allowed one major innovation, but there are just too many innovations on this particular front about taking power away from the powerful and empowering the powerless that come out in the Torah all at once, all woven together. Either it's from God or there's some guy in a cave who we never know about who was the most brilliant political thinker of all time. That's my conclusion.
So you're saying that, and maybe you can give some examples of things that are in the Torah that you're saying are so out of whack with the antiquity or the values of antiquity, that it bespeaks some other kind of force. Because why? Because who could have come up with this? Living in those days, kind of thing. Is that the argument?
Yeah. In other words, it doesn't serve anyone's interest. I'm thinking specifically of how as I said, political power in other cultures they believed in hierarchy, they believed in stratification. That the station you were born into was the station you were meant to be in. And had you said, well, there's really a more enlightened idea, that's called equality, you would have been laughed out of any society in the ancient world because they believe it's not just they didn't come up with the idea of egalitarianism or of equality. It's that they thought that the only way to have an orderly functioning world is where everyone knows their place with no social mobility. And what we see time and again is that the Torah in particular, but the Tanakh generally, is pushing back against this idea from the very fact that God speaks to the entire people. That never happened in any other culture. If God spoke, He spoke only to the kings. The fact that the people are the ones that choose the king, that never happened anywhere else either. The fact that
Mm-hmm.
the king is subject to laws, that never happened anywhere else either. Um, uh, the fact that the temples, the temple, the Beit Mikdash, the temple, it celebrates the connection between God and the people. In Egypt, if you've ever been to a temple in Egypt and you see the enormous colossi statues that are outside of the kings that built them, that's because those temples are dedicated to the connection between the deity and the king. Um, um, in the Torah, the people appoint the judges. That never happened anywhere else until
Mm-hmm.
Montesquieu, a great thinker in the 16th century. The Torah gives out all of the land of the land of Israel to the tribes and to the people. Every single family in Israel gets a piece of the land. That is to say, they get a means of economic sustenance. This idea that the entire land of a country, should not belong to the king, not belong to the temple, but should be given out to the people. That has no precursor there's no precursor in history, and there's no subsequent example of such a thing until the Homestead Act of 1860, when the U.S. government gave all the land to anyone that was willing to move out and suffer the winters that were out there. That was, of course, after they did away with the people that had been there beforehand, but we're not going to talk about that right now. And so there's an incredibly enlightened view of power and of empowering the powerless, especially. Those are just a few examples. Well, I could go
Wow.
on for the rest
Wow.
of our hour talking
No,
about
I
this.
mean
Yeah.
it's funny because I think what's so interesting is I have this conversation with my students, and we kind of take for granted the liberty and the equality and the freedom and those values that, let's say, America rests upon. But
Hmm.
where did those come from? Where did the United States? I mean, I guess it was inspired, the American Revolution, by the French Revolution. But where did the French Revolution get it from? The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment got it from. Where did it all roll back to originally? You
It
know.
rolled back to the Torah. That's what's very clear when you see the early modern thinkers and even the American founding fathers. They're constantly citing the Tanakh, the
Yeah.
Bible, as their inspiration for the ills of monarchy and the importance of empowering the common person.
Yeah. I was going to add also. Do you think, or ask you really, do you think calling for peace and seeing peace as a value, which was also, in a sense, unknown to the ancient world. We have meaning as a value. I think until Nietzsche, power, might made right. And when you see that verse from Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah, beat your swords into plowshares. It's at the UN. Nation shall not lift. So to the modern day person, it appears as though those are, that's been how long? How old is that? In modern society, maybe it's 100 years old. The idea that peace is a virtue, but that's been taught for thousands of years by the prophets.
Right. Good point. Yep.
But let me ask you, just staying on this for a moment. So that is, of course, a strong indication that whoever wrote the Torah, okay, that whoever's behind the Torah was clearly ahead of their time. Okay, that person who came out of the cave and somehow, or what we would believe as God. What about the famous proof of the Kuzari, the great Hebrew poet, and he didn't like to be called a philosopher, but we usually refer to him as such, about are you not a fan of the argument of mass revelation, the argument that the mass nature that we lay claim, that not just Moses or the elders were at Sinai, but that it was to the entire populace, which according to the Bible could have been millions of people, that reduces the chances. I know it's not a positive proof, but it does reduce the chance that the Revelation story was made up. The idea that millions of people would conspire at that time or some later period to fabricate an event and to say that not only did that event take place, but the witnesses of that event were numbered in the millions. What is your opinion of that argument?
Right. So, Rabbi Wildes, as I said, I have to speak truth, and the truth is that I'm not a fan of that argument.
Okay,
And
tell me
reason,
why.
yeah, the reason is that in Hindu folklore, there's a very similar sort of thing where they said, "Oh, the masses saw the following amazing miracles, and that's our proof." So they have exactly the same thing there. So if I believe that the Kuzari's proof, as it were, is a bona fide proof for revelation at Sinai, then I also have to believe that these great Hindu miracles happened, thousands of years ago and were witnessed by millions of people, just like they say they were. So, since I don't want to have to believe in Hindu myths, I don't want to have to put our Torah on that level either.
So I'm going to push back on
Harsh.
that because I heard
Yeah.
you share that. I listened to a couple of podcasts where you were interviewed, and I heard that mentioned. I did a little research, and there is, in fact, such a belief within the Hindu tradition. But their belief is that it was a select group of their sages that heard the revelation. What we're claiming was that it was the entire populace. Now, of course, if you have a group of people, it's better than a single person. But a group of people is still not the same as the masses. Now, we do have other religions claiming that the masses saw miracles, which is what you said. I'm talking about the revelation. I think that's another important distinction, which is that we're not claiming that our ancestors, we're not talking about the splitting of the Red Sea, the Exodus. I'm talking about the giving of the Torah at Sinai, which according to many of my teachers is not really viewed as a miracle. Okay. It was more of an encounter. More of an encounter from God. That's something I heard from one of my teachers, Rabbi Chait, where he said it's not like the splitting of the Red Sea, where you have to ask, how did that happen? Who was behind that? It defies the laws of nature. There was nothing about the giving of the Torah at Sinai that wasn't, obviously God communicating to human beings and making himself audible in human terms is a big deal, but it's not the same thing as seeing an ocean split and then the people chasing you drowned in it after you've been saved through it. So what do you think of that? Like, because I again, and this is very important, the language that we use, I think, is important. I don't believe there's a proof for the giving of the Torah at Sinai. I don't believe I'm also an attorney, so this would not hold up in a court of law in the sense of evidence. But I think what people are looking for is what, the book Lawrence Kellerman wrote, Permission to Believe. What I try to do as a rabbi or as an outreach rabbi is give people permission to believe. And I think you just did that before with your argument from the innovations of the Torah. I think that does give permission to people. But the mass nature, I don't want to lose that. I think that's powerful. And not just homiletically that God cares about all Jews and not just the rabbis and the leaders, but he wants everybody to accept the Torah and to follow its ways. But the idea that that more people listening to it and more people claiming it happened like this reduces the chances of fabrication. So the Hindus, okay, they have a version of that, fine. And I also think there's a sect within Sikhism that also lays claim, but nobody
So
lays
you
claim to say that.
already know more about these other traditions than I do, Rabbi. So I won't comment anymore
Well,
on
no,
them.
you're being honest,
Yeah, yeah.
but no one really says that their entire nation was there for that moment, not when a miracle
Okay.
happened, for that
Mm-hmm.
moment when
Mm-hmm.
when their God is giving over their truth, the way they want their God wants them to live. So therefore,
Mm-hmm.
would it still have credence? This argument, not as proof, but as a little more of a rational basis to, let's say, reduce the chances this whole thing was made up.
Let me put it this way. Um, um, I, I don't personally resonate with that so much. It's not that it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to resonate for other people, but since I have nothing else to compare it to, that it's hard for me to latch onto. But when I read the Torah and how it handles political power, and I see that in about literally a dozen different ways, what we find in the Torah harkens towards developments that would come literally only thousands of years later. And it weaves all of these innovations in a very complex matrix of social life, in economics, politics, calendar, the way it relates to technologies of communication. That does it for me much more because that I can really feel, that I can sense, that I can compare that to other traditions of political thought and measure how revolutionary any one moment was, and this seems to me to be a
A more
blowout.
more
It's a
compelling
blowout.
case.
Yeah, yeah.
And
But that's me. That's me.
is that, no, I hear and I appreciate the honesty. Is that
Hmm.
a you've dealt and you've spent some time on dealing with the documentary hypothesis, the claim that the Torah was written by multiple human authors at different points in history, and what we refer to as I can never pronounce this right, the Pentateuch, or the five books, is really a compilation of different, I think they say, four different independent documents which were
Hmm.
joined together at a certain various point, various point by a series of editors or redactors. That's the claim of the documentary hypothesis. Now, what I've always said is that if that's the situation, then how come that's not part of our story? I kind of go along the same lines as the mass revelation. If the story been handed down by so many people over thousands of years is that
Hmm.
our ancestors all stood at Sinai, then and if that's not the case, and it really was as a result of people who wrote it down at different times, how come that's not the story that we have been telling our children for thousands of years? If the Torah was written by multiple human authors in separate documents, then why isn't that parents and teachers? Why isn't that it hasn't been told? The Jewish story throughout history is that we got the Torah at Sinai, we moved on. So that's my response. So since mass revelation is not as much of a powerful argument for you, or maybe not a compelling argument at all, what would you say? What do you say to your colleagues um, who advocate, the documentary hypothesis or other versions of it that
Yeah.
claim the
Hmm.
Torah was written by people at different times?
Right. My claim is that they are guilty of the original sin, and the original sin in biblical scholarship is the conceit, the intellectual conceit that I have the keys to the whole thing, meaning I can read a text from any time, in any place, in any age, in any language, and if I'm able to get it translated, it will stack up to the literary canons and conventions that I have in my time and in my place. Put differently, since all of us are Greek, yes, you and I, Rabbi Wildes, we are Greek, meaning whether we ever studied any Aristotle or not, all of us in the West have an intuitive sense of what constitutes literary unity, what is a contradiction, what is a disjunction in a text. All of this is from Aristotle's work called the Poetics. And all the things that intuitively would make sense to you and me are from him. And amongst those things are the very seemingly good and legitimate, non-agenda driven questions that academic Bible scholars routinely ask about the biblical text. Why is this story told twice? Why are there contradictions between the telling of the story here and there, such as two accounts of creation at the beginning of
Right.
Genesis, or such
Right.
as some of the stories about Israel in the wilderness in the books of Exodus and Numbers don't seem to line up with the versions that we have in the book of Deuteronomy about those same events, and on and on. And I call this the original sin because, in fact, we know that literary conventions and sense of unity change drastically over time. And in fact, when we look at other ancient works from Egypt, from Babylon, from Ugarit, from the Hittite Empire, all these countries and societies of the ancient Near East, we in fact find exactly the same literary issues of seeming contradiction, seeming repetition, that we find in the Torah, in the five books of Moses. And in those instances, we are certain that they were penned by a single author. For various reasons, this is the way they wrote. Often we can figure out why they were doing that. And those very same reasons apply here. The founding fathers of the documentary hypothesis lived in the 19th century, and they lived before scholars got hold of ancient Near Eastern works, which roughly was the last 20 years of the 19th century and continuing on ever since. So it's all anachronistic, and it's all out of this conceit, an intellectual conceit, as I said before, that, well, it doesn't make sense to me, born in the 20th century, looking at the text with my eyes. So certainly the biblical author couldn't have possibly written that way as well. But we can now begin to understand why those things were written that way when we get hold of other texts.
And you're claiming, thank you, and you're claiming that if we just accept that the Bible was written at a in a different kind of form, not not similar to the way we're used to things today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How does that lead us to believe that there's a divine author behind that? That doesn't
Well, it doesn't.
necessarily.
No, they're right. No, those are two separate things. In other words, when critical scholars come to the conclusion that because of the various literary phenomena that they see within the text, that there must be here more than one author, multiple hands. To that I say, no, you're looking with 21st century eyes, influenced by the works of Aristotle, which biblical authors had no notion of. All that gets us to is that the critique of the Torah, that it was written by multiple hands, is founded on a great
Mhm.
methodological weakness. Okay, that's all.
It's based on sort of modern day thinking
Yep,
categories
yep,
that were not
yep.
extant in the days of the Bible.
Right, but
And
they're
you
very
say,
obvious and intuitive to us. Just if there's any doubt about that, let me if I can, Rabbi,
yeah, please, please.
engage the audience in the following mind game. Okay, it's really illustrative. Um, um, Jews that endured the Holocaust, when did they become survivors? Okay, that's a really weird question. That's a really bizarre question. You might say to yourself, what kind of question is that? Like, what kind of answer could a person give to that? Was that when the war ended? Was it when they were liberated? When they went to a new home? Or why would anyone even ask such a question? So I'm going to say to you that people, the Jews that endured the Holocaust, you know when they became survivors, Rabbi Wildes? In 1979. 1979. What do I mean by that? The word survivor that we use, which is such an obvious word, what else would you call a Jew who had endured the Holocaust other than a survivor, only came into use in the late 1970s. And that's because in 1976 there was this huge miniseries on what they used to call television, Roots, about black slave culture in the U.S.
Sure,
And
sure.
and
I
it
remember the
kind of
movie.
lit a huge awakening of ethnicity and ethnic culture. And then following that, there was this massive miniseries, Holocaust. And that's where finally these people were called survivors. In the late 40s and early 50s, when these people came to the United States, and I'll explain why all this ties together, they were not called
Mm-hmm.
survivors. They were called immigrants. They were called displaced persons. They were called refugees. In Yiddish, they were called Grine, which kind of means like newbies. Nobody
Mm-hmm.
referred to them as survivors. The word survivor, it turns out, has a whole cultural baggage with it that implies ingenuity, strength of spirit, courage, determination. All of that only started in the 1970s. I raised that, Rabbi, because, if you were to say to somebody, once upon a time, Jews that endured the Holocaust were not called survivors, I'm certain that the vast majority of our listening audience would say, what? What else would you call such people? This
Mm-hmm.
just demonstrates how one little thing, the word survivor, which we take as so obvious that that's how you would refer to such people, it turns out, no, once upon a time and not so long ago, this wasn't obvious at all. So so many things. This is what I love about being a scholar. So many things that we take as totally obvious, so we can't even imagine that there was a world that was different. Whoa! Time and time again, I just see vast differences between what was once upon a time and where we are now. You never know where it's going to turn up again. Okay, so when I say
Wow.
that once upon a time people had a
Mm-hmm.
very different sense about how to write, how to communicate, what's a contradiction. There isn't even a word for contradiction in ancient Hebrew or in rabbinic literature. Oh, maybe in rabbinic literature there is. Certainly not in the Tanakh, in the Bible. Yeah, just using that term survivor already alerts us. Whoa! If that wasn't always the way things were, what else wasn't always the way things were? Okay.
Yeah. And is this along the lines? I've taught the Rabbi Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith for many
Mm-hmm.
years. And, I teach it primarily for the same reason a lot of rabbis teach it, because it's just so powerful explaining the existential sort of makeup and composition of humanity. But what Rav Soloveitchik was doing also, I guess as an aside, I don't know if this was the purpose of the book,
Mm-hmm.
was to answer one of those contradictions that the Bible critics bring up that you just alluded to about Genesis chapter 1 versus chapter 2, where Adam and Eve's creation is described very differently. Okay, for example, Adam, just for the listeners, Adam in chapter 1 is described in coming into the world together, created simultaneously with Eve. Zachar nekeva bara otam. God created them, as opposed to chapter 2, where Adam is all alone. That's a story most people are familiar with, and then he's with the animals, and then he takes a long nap, and then he wakes up and Eve's beside him. Okay, so Rav Soloveitchik is explaining that this is done. Whoever wrote the Bible, he doesn't even talk about it there, was trying to give over two aspects, that people are complex. There's an Adam 1 part of us. There's an Adam 2 part of us. There's a part of us that's a, I like to say, like the yuppie that like need two hands are better than one. That's what he's created together with Eve. His job is V'kiv Shua, to conquer the world, versus Adam 2. He has a different perspective. So I love that. Are you saying, is that sort of along the lines of what you're saying, that, we see a contradiction, and in modern times we see a contradiction. It must be that, author A wrote chapter 1, author B wrote chapter 2.
Yeah,
Whereas,
exactly. What what
yeah.
what Rabbi Soloveitchik was doing is not apologetics. We know that this is exact what when he explicates the Torah in that way, the accounts of creation, two totally vastly different accounts in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. He is being faithful to the way that we know, for example, that the greatest pharaoh of all time, Ramses II, otherwise known as Ramses the Great, which many scholars believe was the Ramses of the Exodus. Um, uh, we know that he did exactly the same thing. He had this great battle called the Battle of Kadesh against his archenemy, the Hittites, in 1274 BCE. And we know that when he came home from Egypt, to Egypt, from this battle, he plastered all of Egypt with multiple accounts. I'm talking not just one account here and in another city, another account. In many places, in the same temple or on the same monument, he puts up 2 and sometimes 3 accounts of that battle that are not the same, that are contradictory. Why does he do this? Because he's trying to teach 3 different lessons. One account is about the greatness of
Wow.
his God, Amun. The second one is about his greatness in battle, his valor. And a third account is coming to emphasize the valor of a particular regiment of his army. And it didn't bother him one hoot that he was using different details. The whole point was
Mhm.
to bring out some great idea, some great lesson for his people, for his subjects, and shaping and molding the facts didn't bother him in the least. And no one ever accused him of contradiction, and no one ever thought that this was written by more than one author.
Okay, so this is thank you. This is just to clarify for our listeners. This is not a evidence, therefore, that God wrote the Torah, but this
Right,
is a
right.
response to
That's right.
those who claim this must be proof because A contradicts B. Chapter 1 is different than chapter 2.
Right.
Must be multiple authors. You're saying no. This was something done in the ancient world,
That's right. That's right.
where conflicting versions of the same incident would
That's
be
right.
recorded to teach different lessons. But the
Right.
real reason we believe in Torah Minishamayim, in the Torah coming from God, would be because of so many other things that you find in the biblical text that seem so innovative,
or
at
or
least in
bec-
your
or
mind. I mean,
because
that's
or because it's our tradition. I don't discount that. I think that the Jewish history is an incredible thing. The fact that we're here, against all odds, the fact that the state of Israel has been reborn, and flourishes,
right.
built up from nothing, from the desert, without any precedent, that a language is brought back to life is without any precedent, that a dispersed people has come together is without precedent. All these things I find to be incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, I use that, if you will, in my class when I teach about God. In other
Hmm.
words, the two external supports for the belief of a supernatural creator. One is science, teleological argument, the complexity of the universe. The second is what you just said: is that how do you explain the continued existence of the Jewish people? Hanukkah's approaching, so you could explain the Hanukkah story that we had some very good. The Maccabees were great military tacticians,
Hmm.
and we got the upper hand from the Greeks. We kicked them out, but can you really explain Hanukkah, Purim, every other episode in Jewish history, including 1948, 1967, and so on and so forth? That to me, I think, is a very powerful argument, not for the Torah, but for there being some sort of
Okay.
force guaranteeing the continued existence of the Jewish people.
Yeah, yeah. Or I'll add something that I read, written by my mentor and Rebbe, of blessed and sainted memory, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who who
Mm-hmm.
who notes that from the ancient Near East, the only text that has really survived continuously is the Bible, since that time. And from the period called the Dark Ages, like through the year, I don't know, 800 or 900, the only text, or certainly the longest text, that continues to have any currency anywhere today, the longest text, is the Babylonian Talmud. And this
Mm-hmm.
despite the fact that we have been the most dispersed and the most persecuted of peoples. That's not,
Wow.
that to me is
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah, that is amazing. That is
Hmm.
amazing. Just on that, while we're touching on the Exodus, the splitting of the Red Sea, and all that, I'm curious why you believe it happened. Um, is there some sort of archaeological evidence you're looking at, or you believe it happened because, in general, you accept the Torah for the reasons that we shared earlier, and it's in the Torah. If it's a story in there, since I accept the Bible because of its innovation and other reasons that we've been sharing, or is there something? Is there anything independent that corroborates, let's say, the Exodus, which is a major narrative in the Bible, or even something more specific like the splitting of the Red Sea? Um, Curious if that's a basis, if there is anything out there, if you can share with our listeners.
Okay, so I distinguish for myself here, uh, Exodus and the splitting of the sea. Okay, those are part
Mm-hmm.
of the same story, but the resources that I have to address each are of a different nature. Okay, so with regard to Exodus, by which I mean the claim that there was a people, Israel, enslaved in Egypt, and that they were liberated, and by God. Okay, so let me preface this by with the following little illustration. Um, Many of us who have sat around the Seder table, which I suspect many of our listeners have, probably all,
Mm-hmm.
uh, are familiar from the Haggadah, which the text that we read at the Seder, with the phrase that God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Okay, now that phrase, it turns out, within the Bible, is not a very common phrase and is really only found with regard to the events of the Exodus. We don't find elsewhere that when God does a miracle that that phrase is used, mighty hand and outstretched arm. I raise this because it's just a wonderful coincidence that when we look at the inscriptions of the pharaohs of the Egyptian New Kingdom, 1500 to 1200 BCE, which would fit the period of the enslavement by traditional dating, what we find is that routinely the pharaohs, the escapades of the pharaohs, are described as having been achieved with the pharaoh's mighty hand or the pharaoh's outstretched arm. The pharaoh defeated the Libyans with his mighty hand. The pharaoh bagged 120 elephants with his outstretched arm, and on and on, literally hundreds and hundreds of times. So that what appears that's going on here is that the Torah is engaging in cultural appropriation. That is, the Torah is familiar with ancient Egyptian writings, the propaganda of the pharaohs, and it's seeking to out-pharaoh the pharaohs by stealing their thunder, by using their propaganda against them to describe their own defeat. Okay? That only goes so far as to tell us that some Israelites at some point were apparently quite familiar with some elements of royal Egyptian propaganda. Now, one of my claims takes that and that argument and goes with it on steroids in the following way. That I claim, this is what you were referring to, was covered in the Wall Street Journal, is the following claim: that the story of the Exodus, the Israelites leaving Egypt, being pursued by Pharaoh's chariot army, being led to the sea swallowing them up, and then them offering praise to God for their salvation. There is an incredible series of parallels in similar terms between those two chapters of the book of Exodus and the composition that I referred to before, the battle inscriptions of the Kadesh inscriptions of Ramses II, his battle at this place called Kadesh against the Hittite Empire. And what seems that's happening is that the Torah is stealing that thunder, which was a very well-known work in the time of Ramses and only in the times of Ramses II. We know that even servants at the time knew about it because we found copies of it in their villages in Egypt. And that what the Torah is doing is that it is framing and molding the story of the Exodus so that Israelites coming out would say, "Oh, I get it. The God of Israel is even greater than the greatest king of the greatest period of Egyptian history in his greatest achievement, this Battle of Kadesh." Um, and that type of thing can only happen if there were a serious number of Israelites in Egypt, and if they had experienced something that they construed as a liberating event in the time of Ramses II. Okay, so for that's the short description of why I do believe that there is compelling evidence for an Exodus event. Okay, when we come to the issue of the splitting of the seas, so I don't have the same type of home run evidence. I know that there are people that have seen some type of video that's out there on the internet of what looks like a chariot wheel underwater, and they say, "Oh, there's your proof." No, but that's not serious. That's not serious. And here, the truth of the matter is, as you probably know, Rabbi Wildes, that even within the rabbinic tradition, there have been voices that have wondered: are the events there fully as they are described? Rabbi Soloveitchik, for one, believed that the plagues were as described, more or less, but that they were natural events that happened to occur at just the right moments. Like there's exponential explanations for water turning red, or for an infestation of frogs, etc., etc. In other words, he downplays the kind of supernatural description of the events, and I think Rabbi Jonathan Sachs also in the same vein. What's important for me here,
that was the Rambam's. That was the
I
Rambam's
wasn't
approach.
there, so I don't know. But what is important for me to underscore here is that we live in an age where either accounts that we read are 100% fully factual, or otherwise, in our eyes, they are nothing but fake news, and they lose all their credibility. And I say that when Listeners, if that's the way that you view the Bible, that it has to be 100% accurate or it's fake news, I say to you, the problem is not the Bible is fake news. The problem is such readings are by people who are fake Jews. This is not the way to read the Bible. The Bible, as said explicitly by Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of the land of Israel before the founding of the state, and he said that the Torah is designed to instill messages. It will take events that happen. If it feels that the events described exactly as they were will instill the messages that the
Right.
authors or that God wants to instill, then that is how it will write it. And if God or the other biblical authors believe that it requires an embellishment to make the events have the type of power so that the accounts have the power and teach the lessons that readers and listeners need to hear, then it will do that. And the truth is that this is the way all ancient writers of history worked. So there's nothing unusual
Hmm.
here, but it is important to read the Bible on its own terms. Again, not in our terms.
Right. Right. No, you made that point very powerfully.
Hmm.
Is there, though? I know you're not an archaeologist, but
Hmm.
is there any external? All of this is being from the Torah itself. The language, the
Yeah,
appropriation
yeah,
of Egyptian kind of language. Is there
right.
any other archaeological evidence for the Exodus, or any other
Well,
parts
see,
of the
I,
Bible
I,
you're
I
aware
think
of?
I think that question is a kind of a loaded one in an unfair way, meaning that I think that a lot of people, well-meaning, not necessarily anti-Semitic or atheist, have said, listen, we read the Torah and then we go look at what we have from ancient Egypt, and we have a lot from ancient Egypt, and we don't see any mention of Israelites or of Moses or of plagues or of slaves upping and outing. So I guess there's no proof. And I think that we need to read the other way. We need to read Egypt, i.e., you read something like the Kaddish inscriptions of Ramses II, and then you see that the Torah is intimately familiar with it. That's just as strong. And that there's good
Right.
reason
That's.
why we might not find the type of archaeological evidence that people are looking for. For example, the area where the Israelites were enslaved, which the Bible describes as the land of Goshen, is today totally submerged underwater. So what are you expecting to find? Or, we would say, well, wait a minute, these are such calamitous events that surely anyone writing about the history of Egypt would have mentioned them. Yes, except there was no such thing as writing history. Oh, they wrote about the past. Yes, they did that. They did that. But you have to understand the genre of writing. Okay, it's kind of akin to the following scenario. Imagine that you have an opening in your office and you put out a call for people to submit resumes to fill this position. You get a big pile of resumes, 100 resumes. You go through all of them and you say, wow, what a talented group of people. Not a single one of them was ever fired. And I said to you, how do you know that? You say, well, I went through all their resumes. They wrote about their entire professional experience. Not one of them ever wrote that he was fired. And I would say, well, yeah, that's a resume you're reading. What do you expect? It's the same thing. The Egyptians are writing about the past, not for you and me, Rabbi Wildes. They're writing about the past for their gods. They're submitting reports about how great they were. So they never talk
Yeah.
about bad news. So what do you expect them to write about slaves?
Right. No, I've been sharing that for years, but obviously if we found something, what was wasn't there some reference, I forgot, on one of these slates, an Egyptian, who was it? A great Egyptian archaeologist found Mimeth, not Mimeth, I'm just blanking. Excuse my ignorance. I
The
thought there was
Merneptah
some,
Stela, the Merneptah Stela,
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
reference to
Isn't
Israel.
there,
There
yeah, there
is.
is a reference to
Sure.
Israel there,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. The earliest reference to the term Yisrael, Israel,
Mm.
outside of the Bible, is from Egypt from 1206 BCE. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's in the Egyptian Museum, and it is by Pharaoh Merneptah, one of the pharaohs. And what he describes there is a kind of a military campaign that he launched into what then was known as the land of Canaan, or today, roughly, the land of Israel and Lebanon, maybe part of Syria. And he gives a long list. And, I went to this place and I cut off all their heads. And I went to this place and I wiped them out. And I went to this place and I destroyed it. And he says, and Israel, its seed is no more. What's fascinating about that reference is that in Egyptian, sometimes they give like names, Israel or Ashkelon or Philistines or whatever it might be. And next to it is a little sign that indicates whether that entity is a settled kingdom or a nomadic people. Next to the word Yisrael is the sign for an unsettled people. That means that that might be Israel as they had just entered the land, because we know from the book of Joshua and the book of Judges that when they crossed the Jordan River and entered the land, they didn't capture Israel overnight. There was a long
Hmm.
period of
Right.
unsettlement before there was settlement. So that's a very interesting finding.
And this pharaoh lived after Ramses, the one that we
That's right.
believe
Yeah, he
was,
was right. He was the next one. He was his son. Yeah,
oh, he
yeah,
was the son.
yeah.
And then obviously when he says Israel, its seed is no more, he he's lying about that. We're assuming
Well,
just to show his victory.
Rabbi, Rabbi, here we are, right? I mean,
Yeah, I don't know. Two rabbis having this conversation a few thousand years later seems to
yeah,
contradict that. Okay,
yeah.
wow. Well, this is I'll tell you, I want to share something. Someone listening to this might say, "What does it matter? What does it matter if
Hmm.
these events actually happened or not?"
Hmm.
I was once debating. I was on a panel at the 92nd Street Y many years ago.
Uh-huh.
There was a Reform conservative Reconstructionist rabbi, and I was, I guess, the Orthodox zealot on the stage there.
Hmm.
The conversation was about chosenness and what is our views on chosen. We each had 15 minutes to present. And when I finished my presentation, which was essentially about we were chosen because we had a relationship, and I went through the whole relationship between God and the Jewish people from the days of Abraham. The Reconstructionist rabbi got up and said everything Mark just said was really sweet and interesting, but none of it happened. You see, there was no Abraham. There was no Isaac and Jacob. And then he went on to say that, but does it really matter? Because after all, it really matters just the way we live. And we don't need to believe that these people actually walked the face of the earth, that these are, they could have just been made up mythical figures, but we're learning great lessons from them. Now, I'll tell you the way I responded, but
Hmm.
I'd like to hear your response to that. What would you say to that rabbi? Does it matter? Does it not? If as long as we're making the world a better place, as long as you and I are becoming more ethically refined people, we get people to stop killing other people, we get people to give charity and lead more ethical lives, maybe even become more spiritually connected to some supernatural source out there. What does it matter if this stuff is true or not?
Hmm. So let me respond first as a scholar. The way in which the Torah tells its stories, starting from the patriarchs, uh, is vastly different than myth. Myth never has history. Myth is always one kind of
Mm-hmm.
frame in time. It's never a whole story that plays out over many years, over many generations. So that maybe you could say that the story of creation, or the story of Adam and Eve, or maybe even the story of the flood, seems to have resemblance to myth. But once we get to the patriarchs, we don't find myths that look like those stories. But more to the point,
Mm-hmm.
I think that when you take the Bible
No,
as a
that's
whole,
very. By the way, that's
yeah,
that's very important.
hmm,
I've never heard that, and I appreciate that. Just
hmm,
from the way, because he's making an assumption about myths,
yeah.
and being very detailed types of
Hmm.
stories. But
Right, and
continue,
and
please.
also, the myths, Adam, Eve. When did Adam and Eve live? Where did they live? I don't know. It's somewhere Eden. Where's he? You know what I mean? That has a kind of, you can understand why someone might say that that has a mythic characteristic to it. But myths never talk about concrete people in concrete places in concrete times relative to other historical events. Okay, it's just not the way myth works. Myths are about kind of universal truths by making up, Aesop's fables, a couple of animals talking to each other, a couple of heavenly figures talking to each other. They're never rooted in place or time or anything else that you can like latch onto as part of human history. Um, More significantly, I think that this all matters because if I had to sum up, if you took all of the narratives and all of the prophetic literature, okay, in the Bible, I'm talking now about at least 80 to 90% of what we call the Hebrew Bible. I can sum it up in two sentences. When Israel does God's will, she is rewarded. And when Israel fails to do God's will, she is punished. And here's the proof. because this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Okay. Since that is the overart, what I've just said covers literally
Hmm.
80 to
Yeah,
90% of the
yeah.
Bible, then it only makes sense if the Bible itself believes that these events happened more or less the way they're
Hmm.
depicted.
Yeah. Well, that's powerful. In other words, if so much of the Torah is about the Jewish people either following or not following in God's
Right,
ways,
right. And the consequences of following and not following. That's the important
right?
thing.
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you, my answer was much more practical. It was not nearly as
Okay.
scholarly. They gave me 2 minutes to respond, literally 120 seconds.
Okay.
So I turned back to the audience. And it was a big group, and I said, "Listen, I don't have the time to go into why I think the Torah comes from God, and it's real, and its stories are true. But my colleague just made a claim that it doesn't matter. So I'm going to ask everyone a question here. If God forbid you had a relative on on life support, and you needed to know what the ethics were of taking that person off life support, ending their life, or you live in a very nice neighborhood with nice Jewish day schools, which cost $30,000 a year,
Yeah.
but the public
Right.
school system is
Mhm.
really good and it's free. How many people would be willing to pay $30,000 in this audience
If it
to
didn't
send your
matter.
kids to a Jewish school where they would learn stories that were made up, that were written by people and fabricated and just sort of myths, even though they teach great lessons? Is it really worth the 30K? So, and I said, and so now not one person with 200, at least 200 people in the audience, not one person raised their hand for either of my two questions.
Mm-hmm.
And all I was trying to say was, look, I said, I didn't make a case here for the divinity of the Torah. We'll come back for another conversation about that. I said, but you claimed it doesn't matter. Truth matters. It matters whether this stuff is real or not. I mean, I like the answer you gave, which is that if it's all about following God's way or not following God's way, then all of this stuff being made up does not jive with that,
Right.
right? It has to be real then to see whether or not we're
Otherwise, you're not. Otherwise,
follow,
it's not proving anything. It's not documenting
right.
anything.
Or
Yeah.
otherwise, right. The whole purpose of the Bible seems to be negated. But I'm
Yeah.
saying that in my experience in life, people want to make decisions in life based on something greater than themselves. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to pull that
Mm-hmm.
plug because
Mm-hmm.
they know maybe emotionally I'm feeling this way. But that's the beauty of halacha. The beauty of Jewish tradition is that we can root our behavior in the divine will. I can't prove that, following the Torah is going to give you God's, an expression of God's will, but I've got a rational basis to believe in it. And more important, and what I try to do is I believe in the 51% rule because I don't think anything is provable.
Okay.
Okay, in the legal system, to convict someone of a capital crime, we don't ask the prosecution to prove it 100%. We ask them to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is high, but it's not 100%. And we're willing to take someone's life in certain states in this
Right.
country
Right.
for less than absolute proof. So I think people understand that there isn't 100% proof, but what makes more sense to believe it? That this thing we call the Bible, that Jews have been following for thousands of years, was written by a bunch of people at certain times, or at a certain time, or it comes from a higher place given to us as some sort of gift. And there are arguments both ways. And I think that if making the claim that that it doesn't matter, I think it does.
Yep. That's very
That's my
practical.
feeling.
Yep.
That's
Mm-hmm.
my feeling anyway. Um, I want to ask you a question on a very, very practical level. And we're finishing up here. None of this stuff gets taught in our classic Jewish day schools. And I understand. I wouldn't have this conversation with a seventh or eighth grader. But I was in these conversations. I've of 4 kids. And I had this conversation with almost all of my kids when they were in high school because their teachers weren't having these conversations with them. And they generally wanted to know. And they were curious. And as our kids get into the more rebellious years of adolescence and they start questioning everything, the Bible is going to be one of those things. Now, I get also not all of our teachers are trained to answer these questions
Right,
and
right,
maybe opening up a Pandora's box. But what's
right.
your feeling? What's your feeling about making this somehow part of the curriculum? Because
Yeah,
I'm just seeing how powerful these conversations, even if I don't get everyone to believe in everything, are to my students. And I feel like my own kids and people raised in the modern Orthodox world are deprived of this scholarship that you're sharing, or some of the arguments of the Kuzari, or some, different things resonate with different people. And they don't get any of this. They have to kind of learn it despite the yeshiva curriculum. All right, you already heard my little polemic on this, but what's your feeling about this? And and I'd like to hear both. Whatever it is you feel about this.
I've both thought a lot about it, and I've had a lot of discussions with teachers about it, and I've also been invited into classrooms, yeshiva day school, high school classrooms in the U.S. via Zoom, to have some of these conversations. I think that maybe 80 to 90% of what we've discussed here today, Rabbi Wildes, could easily be incorporated with no downside into the curriculum. If you say, hey kids, this phrase that you all know from the Seder table of mighty hand and outstretched arm, you want to know something really cool about that? Like, this is the way the Egyptians talked about their kings, and the Torah stole their thunder. I mean, there's no downside to that. That just makes the Torah suddenly really interesting, that it does that type of thing. Just sort of the same way that we have, fights here, Black Lives Matter, no, Blue Lives Matter. That same type of dynamic of cultural appropriation or of stealing the thunder of the other side is happening in the Torah as well. What
C-
that
Could
that
I
Yeah,
can I just jump in? Could I play devil's advocate on that? Here's what I would
yeah,
say if I was a principal in that school and you
yeah,
came in and shared it.
yeah,
I would say, Rabbi Berman, I'm nervous now that my students are going to start thinking that the Bible makes a lot of sense given the Egyptian culture in which it came out of, but maybe it doesn't apply anymore today. It's good for the Egypt. It's
right,
good for that
right,
time,
right,
but
right.
if we're trying to sell a Torah that's universal and that's eternal because it's from God.
Eternal. That's the word, eternal. Yeah, right. So how can we come along and say that parts of it are culturally bound and time bound? But the problem is, Rabbi Wild, is that so many of our classical commentators do exactly the same thing. Maimonides
Agreed.
goes to town about
Agreed.
this, and so does
Yeah.
Nachmanides and
Yeah.
Ibn Ezra. These are all, the great medieval commentators on our Torah, and none of them ever had a problem with this. Um, um, this type of investigation or kind of throwing light on various passages in the Torah, in no way negates the eternity of the Torah. The eternity of the Torah does not mean that God somehow suddenly is able to communicate in a kind of divine Esperanto that all men will understand equally in all ages. That can't be, because humans are culturally bound, time bound, and place bound. Our aesthetics change, our modes of communication change. And so there are things in the Torah that are understandable across all ages. And then there are certain things in the Torah that are more accessible to one age and other things that are more accessible to another age. That's how you have the eternity of the Torah. When we say the rabbinic statement that there are 70 faces to the Torah. Okay? What that means is there's no one simple reading of the Torah that says it all and says it the same way with equal force to all Jews at all time. It means that there's a multifaceted, multi-faced Torah. And this is just one of those 70 faces. So I don't think that it negates the eternity of the Torah in any way. And I
Well,
don't think that,
but I'm
our
gonna
yeah,
I'm
go
gonna
ahead.
push back on that. I'm gonna, if with your permission, I'm gonna push back on that a little, because a lot of people who are a little more skeptical will say that this clearly, you read it, it looks like it's coming out of some ancient Egyptian kind of, at least the Exodus story, you know the and therefore it should be limited to that. What's eternal about that? Because our Dibur Torah B'Lashon B'nei Adam, the rabbis teach us, the language of the Torah is the Torah had to be written in the language of man so we can understand. But if God's the author, why couldn't God have come up with a language that didn't make it seem so tied to a particular age to lead us to think it would only apply in that age and not ours?
Well, I think that the Torah, again, communicates in many, many ways. And again, in some generations, latch on to one part, understand one part more than others.
Hmm.
I think that there's nothing wrong with saying that the Torah is given in the time of Moses, and therefore had to communicate in a very primary, simple way to the people of that time, using those conventions of thought and writing
Mhm.
and composition. And that there are just many other aspects of the Torah which are, which speak to all generations. Um, I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that the
I'll tell
great
you something.
rabbis believe that. Yeah, yeah.
Something someone shared with me, a little controversial. He asked me about how I felt about Judaism and homosexuality, and we were having a conversation. A student of mine, actually not a student of mine, like a friend, guy who went to yeshiva, your yeshiva actually, and to Gush, and he said, "Listen, when the Torah forbids homosexuality, you have to understand the context of homosexuality in the Bible." And the kind of homosexuality that the Bible, or at the day in those days, were people that were heterosexual, but as a purely physical pleasure would engage in homosexuality. So that maybe that's what the Bible,
Hmm.
maybe that's what the
Hmm.
Torah means when it
Hmm.
forbids homosexuality. It doesn't
Right.
mean two men who truly fall in love with each other and have a
Hmm.
real relationship.
Hmm.
It's talking about someone who's not born gay, who's really heterosexual, but is
Let's
is
say, let's say, yeah, let's say, it has no bearing on our practice today. The reason for that is that the halacha, the law that we follow, is never, never was the literal meaning, the literal word of the Torah. There was always interpretation given over to Moses, to the Sanhedrin, to the sages across the ages, uh, and we follow the law as it has evolved, and there's no going back. So, it could be that one day there will be a Sanhedrin, a great court of 70 great sages of the world, as there once was. And I think that they have a lot of leeway to interpret things in many different ways. But lacking that type of the buck stops here unifying element, what we have is the law as we have it now. And if we go inventing new ways, even if they were maybe the way the text once was meant to be read way back when, that has no bearing on right now. Right now, as the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Joseph Kara wrote, we live in an age where we face the threat of many Torahs. That's his word, many Torahs, many people interpreting the law as they see fit, and then you and I will never be able to keep Shabbat together or eat in each other's homes because each and every one of us will have a different opinion of the law. So the question of how might the Torah have once meant things to be? It might have meant it at one point, but the permission is given over to the sages of Israel to determine the law for their generation and each and every generation, and therefore we have the
right.
law that we have today. That's my
No,
take
I,
on
I
it.
agree. I agree with that, and that's what I emphasize to my students in terms of we can't just, it says an eye for an eye. We don't just read that literally. We have a tradition as to how to understand that phrase, like any
Hmm.
phrase in the Bible,
Hmm.
no different than, let's say, homosexuality. I'm bringing it up just because I'm struggling with this because when I read the Torah, it
Sure,
does
I think we all
seem
do. Yeah.
like it just seems to be a written within a certain cultural, and you're acknowledging that as a Bible scholar, but it then gives license, I feel, to some people to say, well, let's understand it within the times, that it was that it's describing these stories at a certain period of time. So that's what it meant over then. Homosexuality meant that then. You know what I'm saying? That's the only concern. But listen, we do have Rishonim, as you said. We do have great commentators and sages, that do look at these Bible stories and verses in the Torah within the context of their time. They clearly did. Yeah. All right. Heavy stuff. I want to thank you for your time. I could literally sit here forever and continue to pick your brain on this. But I don't have to tell you what an important position you occupy, Rabbi Berman, as
Oh, thank you.
trying to synthesize, as my teacher, Rabbi Lamb of blessed memory,
Mm,
who used to like to use the word synthesize of like the best of
right,
Western
that's
culture
right.
with.
Yeah, right,
I
right.
feel like you're doing that a lot with.
Hmm.
I feel like you're doing that a lot with the Torah, with the Bible, and we should be bringing you more into the world of outreach, because people respect
Okay.
literary scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
So you let me know the next time you're in New York. It would be a great honor to be able to host you here. But I thank you for your time and for your scholarship and your expertise. And Shem should bless you. You should continue to write and publish and teach for many, many years, and continue to illuminate and to elucidate our Torah for us.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Wildes, and thank you for everyone who's listened in today.